Clovis roamed the glacial tills of the Montana highline as a boy, he hadn't yet realized that he was walking in the footsteps of the very first Montanans who lived there over 13,000 years ago. But he would become a renowned Montana archaeologist and take it upon himself to embark upon his search for the first Montanans. This is a story of archaeology in Montana, and one man's quest to find evidence of the first people to live and prosper there.
Thomas Jefferson had much to think about in 1803 as he prepared to send Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore the vast, uncharted Louisiana Purchase. The logistics were daunting. The Indians were unpredictable, and if that wasn't enough, the expedition could encounter the American incognito.
This was the name given to a fabled beast imagined only because of a massive molar unearthed in upstate New York in 1705. Jefferson was obsessed with 7-foot tusks and molars the size of a man's fist that he displayed along with Native American artifacts in his museum-like entrance at Monticello.
He entertained the possibility that a giant carnivorous clawed animal, entirely unknown to science, as he described it, still existed in the remote American West. French naturalist Georges de Buffon had recently written an essay titled Theory of American Degeneracy. Count de Buffon contended that European megafauna were larger and more intimidating than American species, and Native Americans were inferior to indigenous Europeans. Jefferson was offended. What better way to one-up the haughty Frenchman than to find the American incognitum still living in North America? Actually, the oversized fossils he had collected were from the American mastodon that had existed in northeastern American forests during the Ice Age.
So Jefferson asked Lewis and Clark to keep an eye out for the mythical American monster as they explored the untamed land west of the Mississippi.
As the voyagers made their way, day by day, they never found the beasts of Jefferson's desire, but they made the very first archaeological observations in Montana. In their journals, they wrote of stick and bark lodges along the Missouri River, ceremonial structures with painted buffalo skulls, petroglyphs on Pompey's pillar on the Yellowstone, and a recent buffalo jump with over 100 rotting carcasses. Other than these incidental observations, nothing was known about the deep human past in Montana.
Some folks like the summertime when they can walk about, strolling in the meadow green. It's a pleasure, there's no doubt.
Montana has always been a harsh, unforgiving environment. Yet humans have lived there since the end of the Ice Age, 13,000 years ago, maybe longer. This is a story of archaeology in Montana,
and one man's quest to find evidence of the first people to live and prosper there. Les Davis was a wild kid of the Montana prairie. He was born in Shelby in 1935 on the windswept, brittle plains of the Montana Highline, hugging the southern Canadian border. He was raised in a tar paper shack in the Kevin sunburst oil fields. His best friends, he said, were scarce library books and secondhand comics. He later wrote, "I was drawn to rattlesnakes, badgers, coyotes, pronghorn antelope, white-tailed jackrabbits, prairie gophers, swift foxes, bobcats, and mule deer on salt flats, with sagebrush and cactus margins, and in wild rimrock country. My life seemed to resonate with those wild places and wild creatures. Actually, I wasn't so different from them."
Davis would become a renowned Montana archaeologist. He had a wry sense of humor and a gregarious personality. Like Indiana Jones, for nearly 50 years, he explored the far reaches of the vast Montana landscape, searching for deeply buried, well-hidden clues to its prehistoric inhabitants.
Les Davis was in the 4th grade in 1945 when the family moved to Cut Bank, Montana. He worked on his grandfather's dryland wheat farm on the Mariah Slope, operating heavy machinery over the gravelly glacial terrain. The obvious life path for young Davis was farming or ranching, yet his interests leaned more toward writing and the arts. He sang in the Cut Bank High School choir. As a senior in 1954, he was editor of the yearbook and a cast member in the senior play. But this was Montana, and this way of agriculture was hard to resist.
It came time to go to college, and that was the first year that they had a counselor, vocational counselor. And I remember my contact with him was very short. "Well, what are you going to do, Les? You're going to college?" "I sure am." "What are you going to take?" "Agriculture," I said brightly.
And so, Davis entered Montana State College in Bozeman to pursue his engineering degree. But when he got to the big city campus, his perspective began to change.
His engineering course loads felt oppressive, and fraternity life was not a good fit. He was restless and spinning his wheels.
In engineering, he later said, "I felt like I was being trained to be an automaton, and I don't have that kind of mind." When Davis took the English for Engineers class, his professor was a quirky iconoclast named J. Vern Dusenberry. Dusenberry grew up in Bozeman and became a high school English and drama teacher in small schools across Montana. He easily related to Native Americans and was adopted by a Pend Oreille chief at the age of 31 and given the name Many Grizzly Bears. Dusenberry joined the Department of English at Montana State College in 1947. Unfortunately, he was derided by some of his peers for his close kinship with Native Americans. "Vern and his Indians," they would scoff. One colleague saw through the cultural prejudice and academic backbiting. Robert Pirsig, who would later write the cult philosophy classic Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, taught creative writing at Montana State College. He was one of the few faculty members who could relate to the unconventional Dusenberry and his empathy for Native peoples. Pirsig thought Dusenberry was unfairly targeted in academia and told his story in his second novel, Lila, An Inquiry into Morals.
In the book, Pirsig's alter ego, Phaedrus, recognized Dusenberry's dilemma, that he had become part of the Indian culture, and not an objective observer as demanded by academic anthropology. Dusenberry lit a fire in the imagination of Les Davis. When Dusenberry eventually decided to abandon the toxic environment in his current position, Davis followed him to the University of Montana in Missoula.
But he was going over there to get a master's degree in anthropology. And he was a great teacher. So I transferred over there at the same time in the spring of 1956. And that's where I discovered anthropology. Really got into it. It was a great intrigue. My curiosity was really inspired.
This was the academic and intellectual environment that inspired Davis to change his life course. Encouraged by Dusenberry, Davis spent the winters of 1959 and 60 interviewing Pend Oreille elder Peter Beaverhead and his wife Josephine at their home in Ronan, Montana. But his anthropological roots were about to take a turn toward prehistoric archaeology. In the winter of 1962, Havre resident Paul English asked Vern Dusenberry to help with the formation of a local amateur archaeological society as a chapter of the Montana Archaeological Society. Dusenberry had taken a position counseling troubled and underserved Native American students at the Northern Montana College and was eager to help organize the group. Soon, the Milk River Archaeological Society had its first meeting, and some attendees who had expected to discover places to dig arrowheads were, no doubt, disappointed. They quickly realized that the organization was all about a professional approach to amateur archaeology. A young Ann Johnson, future Yellowstone National Park chief archaeologist, fell into the Milk River Society by chance.
Across the street from my grandmother's house was a family, the Stalkups, and there was a girl who was a couple years younger than my cousin. And so they were not close friends, we're friends. And it was an easy thing for me to go across the street because I was in between in age. And it turns out that this girl had a father whose name was Emmett Stalkup, and he was interested in everything. I mean, in the stars and in fossils and everything, and it just lit my fire.
With palpable excitement, the group gathered all the literature and equipment they could find and set up a lab and research library in Emmett Stalkup's basement. That spring, Dusenberry transferred back to Montana State College in Bozeman, and Les Davis moved his young family to Havre to fill Dusenberry's spot counseling Native American youth at Northern Montana College. Now residing in his new position at Northern Montana College, the motivated young scholar Davis became the guiding influence for the Milk River Archaeological Society. Davis and Stalkup became great friends and co-authored several important early monographs.
There was an announcement in a local newspaper about a group that was being formed of persons interested in the local archaeology. And so I read that, followed up by going to their first meetings.
As a wide-eyed, enthusiastic teenager in 1960, John Brumley wandered the hummocky glacial tills of the Montana Highline.
When the train had gone through, the Great Northern had bulldozed a track west of Havre, cutting into the bank, and when they cut into the bank, they encountered these buffalo bones. So John went out looking at this, and lo and behold, he found a big buffalo jump complex of the drive lines and the camp and the stratified kill site, just basically within the city limits of Havre.
When the Milk River Archaeological Society formed, Brumley jumped at the chance to share his discovery with the exciting new organization. A great concern of the fledgling society was the frenzied arrowhead collecting and pot hunting occurring across the state. In fact, the first name they gave to Brumley's bison kill site was Too Close for Comfort because of the proximity to the town of Havre. Later, Les Davis suggested a more appropriate name, Wakpachugan, translated as Little River, the Assiniboine name for Milk River. In 1964, the Milk River Society excavated the Keister site and extensively vandalized bison kill in the Missouri Breaks. The corner-notched Pelican Lake points found at the site represent a culture of atlatl-wielding hunter-gatherers. They were some of the first to heavily utilize mass kill strategies like bison jumps. They created elaborate drive lines to direct bison off a cliff or into an impoundment where they could be killed and butchered. These Northern Plains people thrived from 3,500 to 1,600 years ago by repeatedly using the same strategic methods to hunt herds of bison and sometimes antelope. Ann Johnson was cutting her archaeological teeth at the Keister site.
And Keister was really important because it helped clarify ages of the Pelican Lake Point. And, we got to remember that we didn't have very many radiocarbon dates back then. And archaeologists today look at a point and say, oh, well, that ranges from this time period to that time period. We didn't have that kind of confidence or knowledge back then. And so Keister was really important, and it was a great bonding experience because we had some difficulties with the weather. It rained like torrential rains, and we got stuck out there in the gumbo and on and on.
Davis and Stalkop published the Keister and Wakpachugan sites in early issues of Archaeology in Montana, the Journal of the Montana Archaeological Society. Davis's journey through Montana time would take him from the end of the Ice Age, over 15,000 years ago, all the way to the time of late prehistoric Plains Indians. One of Davis's early studies was of the first bow and arrow people on the Northern Plains, the Avonlea culture, named after a site in Avonlea, Saskatchewan. The culture first appears around 100 AD. His paper, Avonlea Point Occurrence in Northern Montana and Canada, was published in Plains Anthropologist and explores the distribution of the earliest bow and arrow culture on the Northern Plains. As the young stalwarts of the Milk River Archaeological Society began to pursue their professional careers, the society slowly dissolved. But the legacy of this thrilling collaboration would live on. In 1966, Les Davis moved to Calgary to develop his ambitious PhD dissertation, The Prehistoric Use of Obsidian in the Northwestern Plains. John Brumley followed Les to Calgary to get his degree in archaeology. He ultimately directed the development of the Wakpachugan site as a living museum exhibit at the H. Earl Clack Memorial Museum in Havre. Emmett Stalkop became a judge and justice of the peace in Havre and continued to collaborate with Davis. Ann Johnson moved to Missoula to pursue her master's degree in archaeology, creating a comprehensive cross-referenced bibliography of Montana archaeology. She eventually became chief archaeologist in Yellowstone National Park. On a hazy, late summer morning in 2017, a group of professional and amateur archaeologists gathered at the famous MacHaffie Paleo Indian site south of Helena, Montana. Led by Montana archaeologist Patrick Rennie, a former Les Davis student, the group planned to reopen the site in honor of Davis, who had died of a heart attack in 2014.
So you've got materials going back right based on radiocarbon dates that would probably extend 9,000 years, all the way up to about 2,000. The upper level of sediment contains what looks like a mixture of materials extending back probably 4,000 radiocarbon years before present. And then it seems like there's pretty much a break, and then you get into some really old stuff we call Paleo Indian materials. Les was always hindered by the high water table. Water tables drop, so we're trying to finish up some work for Les more than anything else, and just see if there's anything that may be Folsom. We'll see what we get. So basically this is just an effort to do what Les always wanted to do, and that was see how deep the materials go.
The MacHaffie site is internationally known. It has been recognized as the premier Paleo Indian site in the Northern Rockies. And the story of its importance really doesn't begin in Montana at all.
Prior to the year 1859, the concept of prehistory did not exist. In the mid-17th century, Archbishop Usher boldly calculated from biblical scripture and other writings that the earth was created around 6 p.m. on October 22nd in the year 4004 BC. By the mid-18th century, through years of observing Earth processes, James Hutton developed the principle of uniformitarianism. Hutton reasoned that the Earth is in a state of perpetual change as a result of uplift, erosion, and sedimentation. He recognized that sediment from eroding mountains is laid down horizontally, in oceans or floodplains, for example, with the older material deposited at the bottom and successively younger layers above. This created a chronological layer cake stratigraphy. He theorized that the gradual erosion and sedimentation that can be observed in the modern age is an analog for Earth processes through time. Over half a century later, in 1830, Charles Lyell, the preeminent geologist of the day, popularized the work of Hutton in his famous text, Principles of Geology. Uniformitarianism became the foundation upon which all of geology and archaeology would be based. Lyell came to believe that the Earth was indefinitely old. He coined the term Pleistocene as a new geological epoch indicated by massive silts and gravels along with large erratic boulders that had been deposited by receding glaciers and ice sheets. This has come to be known as the Ice Age. Extinct mammal remains were found in these deposits, but not in the overlying sediments. Still, without modern absolute dating technologies, like radiocarbon dating, the actual age of the deposits was elusive. At around the same time, French archaeologist and antiquary Boucher de Pere was finding unusual chipped flints in the Somme River valley of France. He found what appeared to be primitive hand axes in the Pleistocene gravels, and he was certain that the flints were the work of human hands. A few years later, after finding extinct elephant and rhinoceros bones intermingled with the hand axes, Boucher de Pere hypothesized that humans coexisted with the extinct Ice Age mammals. In 1859, Charles Lyell verified the Pleistocene age of the gravels, and Boucher de Pere's theory of the antiquity of man was presented to the Royal Society of London. The theory soon gained near universal acceptance. By establishing the existence of humans in the Pleistocene, Boucher de Pere was the first to confirm the antiquity of humans on Earth. In the same year, Charles Darwin published his general theory of evolution. The stage was set for a revolution in scientific and social thinking. And this great paradigm shift did not go unnoticed across the Atlantic. As civil unrest was brewing in America, the seeds of a new scientific controversy were beginning to germinate in the American scientific community. Since the antiquity of humans on Earth had been verified in 1859, American archaeologists like Charles Abbott searched for Ice Age man in America. Discoveries of chipped stone spear points similar to those from the European Stone Age were being found across North America. Abbott, a physician and naturalist, found crude stone tools in the glacial gravels of New Jersey during the 1870s. He claimed to have found glacial man in America and was even called the American Boucher de Pere by some. But not everyone was on board with the idea of Stone Age humans in America. Abbott had powerful detractors from the formidable Smithsonian Institution. William Henry Holmes, of the Bureau of American Ethnology, and his successor, Czech anthropologist Alice Erdlicka, curator at the U.S. National Museum, became the key antagonists in the American Paleolithic controversy. Holmes and Erdlicka, it seemed, went out of their way to disprove strong evidence of ancient man in America. Holmes argued that the primitive stone implements from the New Jersey gravels could simply be preforms or unfinished tools of more modern Indians. Erdlicka, known as the Bone Doctor because of his study of human skulls, was an early proponent of scientific racism. He believed that humans entered the Americas no earlier than 3,000 years ago, and if Ice Age humans existed in the Americas, their skeletal remains should look like Neanderthals.
The classic story about him being wrong, I think, was he wanted to prove that by the shape of a person's skull, you could determine if they were going to be a criminal or they were prone to insanity or whatever. And he was apparently a very gifted writer and capable of presenting a supremely logical argument for a case that was probably not true.
During the hot August of 1908, a heavy rainstorm inundated the headwaters of the Cimarron River, and a devastating flood washed through the town of Folsom, New Mexico. Many people died that day, and great quantities of earthen debris and vegetation washed out of the desert canyon, along with thousands of years of human cultural artifacts. George McJunkin was an African-American cowboy, foreman at the Crowfoot Ranch upstream from Folsom. He was born into slavery in 1851 and later became a self-educated amateur naturalist. A few days after the storm, McJunkin rode out on his horse to survey the flood damage. In a narrow drainage called Wild Horse Arroyo that was deeply carved out by the torrents, McJunkin spied some unusual bones sticking out of the arroyo wall. He recognized that the bones were abnormally large, and he shared his discovery with a friend and fellow naturalist, Carl Schwackheim. Schwackheim attempted to alert various authorities, but was greeted with skepticism at every turn.
Report from a black man, uneducated, from New Mexico, was just discounted.
Unfortunately, McJunkin died before his discovery was recognized. It took almost 20 years for Schwackheim to finally convince Jesse D. Figgins of the Colorado Museum of Natural History to take a look.
Figgins was impressed and hired Schwackheim to continue the excavation. In 1927, Schwackheim located a delicate fluted spear point in situ between two bison rib bones. Paleontologist Harold Cook identified the bones as from an extinct bison species. This placed the age of the spear point at more than 10,000 years old, when the giant Bison antiquus had become extinct. Despite the ongoing bitter scholarly debate, this was finally enough evidence for most of the scientific community to accept that there was a deep human past in America. Figgins named the site and point type Folsom.
Only a few years after the discovery of Folsom verified the antiquity of humans in America, University of Pennsylvania archaeologists unearthed an even older culture beneath the Folsom layer at Blackwater Draw near Clovis, New Mexico.
A larger, more crude style of fluted projectile point was found associated with extinct mammoth bones.
This newfound Clovis culture would become the most controversial Paleo Indian discovery in American archaeology, because it quickly became regarded as the first human culture to populate the Americas. A near hiatus from field research during World War II led to a post-war surge of interest in archaeology.
World War II ends. The Corps of Engineers and Bureau of Reclamation begins developing dams up and down the Missouri. And they hear that someplace near East Helena, grade schools are sending their kids out to collect arrowheads. You know, it's a field trip, a field day. And some of these points are unusually large.
The year was 1951. Richard Forbes sat in his canvas wall tent at the MacHaffie archaeological site a few miles south of Helena, Montana, puzzling over some of the oldest artifacts ever found in North America. The sweet smell of pipe tobacco, oil-treated canvas, and pungent kerosene fumes filled his nostrils.
The history is long. Actually, it's as long as anything that we probably got in Montana as far as interest and research goes. It had been collected by locals, arrowhead hunters, since at least the early 40s, probably the 30s, maybe going back farther than that.
Digging down through thousands of years of Montana time, Forbes found evidence of middle to late archaic hunters, using the site from 7,000 to around 2,000 years ago. below that level, he uncovered a Scott's Bluff component dated to 10,000 years ago. And digging deeper, he found Folsom-style Paleo Indian projectile points, which pushed the age of this secluded Montana campsite to more than 11,000 years ago. At the end of the 1951 field season, the New York Times hailed the MacHaffie site as the first clearly stratified Paleo Indian occupation with a Folsom component at the bottom and continuous occupation for over 10,000 years. It was also recognized as the northernmost excavated site of its kind in North America. Les Davis later became good friends with Dick Forbes and would come back to MacHaffie numerous times to continue the study of this deep record of human occupation in Montana. In 1989, Davis confirmed the Folsom component at MacHaffie and uncovered traces of Paleo Indian deposits beneath the Folsom level. But the water table stopped him from going deeper, as it had stopped Forbes almost 40 years earlier. Evidence uncovered by both Forbes and Davis at MacHaffie indicates the site was a seasonal campground where toolmakers chipped flint to make stone tools and spear points from easily accessible local stone. While camping at the site, the Folsom people preyed on the now extinct bison Antiquity, as well as wolves, foxes, cottontails, and jackrabbits.
We found the remnants of dozens of dinners, bones that had been butchered and cooked for marrow or fat or grease or just stripped of meat. Some that might have tooth marks on them that might have been human, or they might have been dog or whatever. And we were able to identify the different kinds of animals that they ate.
Local collectors, local pot hunters knew about this site and had been picking up arrowheads for several years prior to 1951.
This profile from a 1998 Les Davis excavation at MacHaffie hit home when they discovered the outline of a vandal's pit in their excavation wall. The shovel pit nearly reached the Paleo Indian level. No toothbrushes and ice picks were used here. In his career, Davis made it a priority to educate people of the importance of leaving artifacts in place to preserve the context of Paleo Indian lifeways. Les Davis came to archaeology in the late 1950s, only 2 decades after the Clovis culture had been accepted as the oldest evidence of humans in the New World.
Older archaeologists were raised to believe that there was nothing earlier than glacial gravels. So that Clovis was the earliest. You're not going to find anything that predates the last ice age termination. And so, you're looking at 12,500, 800 years or whatever, and we wouldn't find anything older, period. So we didn't look.
The theory became known as Clovis first. It was an elegant and seductive hypothesis. As the theory goes, the Wisconsin glaciation reached its maximum around 21,000 years ago. So much planetary water was imprisoned in the massive Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets that sea level around the world was over 100 meters lower than today. The west coast of North America extended as much as 200 kilometers out beyond modern shorelines. Today's Bering Sea was a vast grassy plain connecting Asia with North America.
Asian Paleo Indians crossed the so-called Bering Land Bridge, pursuing herds of woolly mammoth to Alaska.
But they were stopped in their tracks on the Alaskan peninsula by a frigid wall of ice.
Over time, climate change began to melt the ice barrier. Eventually, an ice-free corridor opened on the east side of the Rocky Mountains around 13,000 years ago. This provided a pathway for the Clovis people to migrate south of the ice. According to the Clovis first theory, these intrepid explorers were the first people to populate the Americas.
We operate with such blinders on, whatever our training was, it's hard to ever get out of that mindset and to keep moving along with changing concepts. But, it was hard not to be trapped in the Bering Land Bridge is the only possibility. And it controlled the mind of Western American archaeologists from that moment forward.
The southern exit of the ice-free corridor spilled right onto the windswept plains where Davis grew up.
To the nascent thinking of Les Davis, the first stop of Paleo Indians entering the New World was Montana.
In July of 1967, in far eastern Lindsay, Montana, dry land farmer Joe Walker was running his combine along a Dawson County road when he spied some white chalky material weathering out of the borrow pit. Upon closer examination, he was stunned by its size and thought that it looked like pieces of a fossilized elephant tusk. News of the find made its way to Montana State University in Bozeman, and young PhD candidate Les Davis was hired to direct the Lindsay Mammoth Recovery Project. Over 30 hot days in July and August, Davis and 6 students painstakingly uncovered the massive mammoth grave. Like a Greek statue carved from a block of stone, the extinct Pleistocene elephant emerged from the Ice Age silt. Here was Davis's first big archaeological puzzle, and he treated it forensically, as though it were a crime scene.
He observed 9 small angular blocks of sandstone associated with the mammoth skeleton. However, there was no sandstone outcrop nearby. How did the sandstone blocks get there?
But those 9 pieces of sandstone don't refit together. And none of them show any use as hammering and battering. But the question is, why are there 9 pieces of sandstone either touching or lying next to parts of the mammoth skeleton?
A clue came from the mammal's front femurs. They were crushed as if a human might have extracted their protein-rich marrow. Davis was also suspicious of the unnatural way in which the bones were arranged.
On close examination, he noticed what appeared to be cut marks on the bones that might have been caused by butchering with stone tools.
The crew sealed the exposed bones with resin and later cast them in plaster for the trip to Montana State University. Davis would study the mammoth for the rest of his career. Eventually, PhD candidate Catherine Krasinski confirmed his suspicion that the cut marks on some of the bones were made by humans.
It's radiocarbon dated now at 13,500 years, which is about 2,000 years earlier than Clovis complex. So it is pre-Clovis. But they did come upon an injured or dead mammoth. They scavenged the skeleton, took it apart, stacked bones on top of one another like only humans can do, rearranged other bones, the tusks, the teeth, and left cuts on the bones of stone tools.
The Lindsay mammoth was a mature, 50-year-old Columbian mammoth bull, standing 14 feet tall at the top of its bulbous head. The deathbed was only 12 miles south of the terminus of the continental ice sheet, which covered nearly all of Canada and the northern tier of the United States. As the ice melted, lakes formed along the edge of the receding glacier. The warming climate dried the meltwater lakes, and strong winds carried the fine lake silts across the landscape, much like the Dust Bowl of the early 20th century. The Lindsay mammoth was preserved under 4 feet of this fine wind-blown sediment. Now, early in his career, Davis became a professor of anthropology at Montana State University. He was about to embark on a 40-year odyssey seeking clues to the prehistoric habitation of Montana. The headwaters of the Missouri River, a fertile confluence of 3 major Rocky Mountain drainages in Montana. A place where wildlife and people naturally congregate. In 1971, Davis learned about a mysterious rock outcrop overlooking the Madison River north of Three Forks, Montana.
We discovered one day when a rancher came up and said, "What the hell are you doing out here?" And I said very calmly, "I'm Les Davis. I'm professor of anthropology at Montana State University, and we're here developing one of the most important archaeological sites in the Western Hemisphere. Who are you?" "I'm Floyd Schmitt. I own this place." But we became very good friends, and he permitted us to work there for the next 17 years.
Every spring over those 17 years, Davis brought his Intro to Archaeology classes to the quarry to study and help dig out the ancient site.
It's an absolutely impressive prehistoric mine. All radiocarbon dates, which there's a whole sequence of dates less obtained for the site, and projectile point styles are exclusively what we call Pelican Lake, or Late Archaic, a large corner-notched atlatl-sized point that ranges from approximately 3,000 to about 1,800 radiocarbon years before present.
This is an extreme case of the extent to which prehistoric peoples went to acquire high-quality stone. We presume that they mined deep into limestone bedrock to obtain unweathered chert. It's a glassy material highly desired for tool making. The chert occurs in many colors and forms in this quarry site, principally brown and reddish materials of high quality. They occur as nodules and as lenses inside of the limestone where they formed by replacing the limestone materials with silicates. They've used a hammerstone to batter from this surface and remove flakes. These flakes then were later worked using pressure techniques to form the various kinds of tools that were necessary to sustain life. Projectile points, knives, scrapers, perforating tools, cutting, all kinds of implements that they found necessary.
What's really interesting about the Schmitt site is it is a true hard rock mine. These people were hammering their way through massive amounts of limestone bedrock and actually tunneling back through the limestone bedrock as well.
During the years leading up to 1976, the country prepared to celebrate the American Revolution bicentennial. Film student Richard McCallum was taking Davis's intro to archaeology class, and he needed a subject for his senior film. Davis and McCallum collaborated to produce The Changing Dawn, a philosophical film recreation of the Pelican Lake people working the Schmitt chert mine. This was an opportunity for Davis to bring to life the culture of these industrious Native Americans, whose chert mining activities sustained many generations of families in this remote Rocky Mountain headwaters. With a mere $3,000 bicentennial grant, they enlisted students from the class as actors and created one of the earliest film representations of Stone Age lifestyles in Montana.
In this year of our bicentennial celebration, we can learn from the ingenuity and courage shown by earliest men. Indeed, the day may come when the teachings of archaeology can be applied as history to the problems of today and tomorrow. By establishing archaeological sites as historic landmarks and national monuments, future generations will be enabled to appreciate the strivings, successes, and high spirit of those who went before.
I think I would have thrown my hands up in frustration at the nature of the disturbance of this site, and how less even understood how deep to go always amazed me. I would have stopped again when we start hitting large, massive pieces of limestone bedrock, pieces the size of a Volkswagen. And no less would send students down into the pit without eye protection, without helmets, with sledgehammers, and we'd reduce giant boulders into pieces big enough to fit into these small rubber buckets, which were then roped up a makeshift wooden slide, while other students, also equally unprotected, are bent over in the pit below excavating, while tons of rock are being lifted out over their heads.
The rock just kind of caved in on me, caved in my head, shoulders, and somehow instinctively I just kind of flopped out, rolled out to the one side, and some of those rocks kind of rolled down on my feet and ankles.
And we can laugh about it now, but what I remember most from that experience with Steve was, for what was it, 2 weeks you had to wear a tank top to all the classes because your road rash was so horrific on his shoulders.
And I had stitches in my head, top of the head up here.
And amazingly, Les never lost a student, although major injuries always occurred. But those were different times. I mean, there was no thought of lawsuits or the need for any kind of safety.
They mined there from about 1300 BC till 200 AD. It's about a 1500-year span of time. And as we reckon generations, you divide about 40 into that, and you'll see how many generations were active in doing this. Now this is where they mined it and made a few tools, but they basically carried this chert that they had extracted down to what is now a large cultivated field of about 350 acres. They took it down there, built their fires, cooked, ate, and worked the stone. And we have very large collections that were made in the cultivated field and can compare what they were doing there with what they were doing in the mine.
So this is a good example of one of the ribs that was used at the Schmitt site by the people who were mining the chert nodules at the Schmitt site. It's a very long, well-preserved piece of rib. It comes to this rounded, polished tip, the result of this being used extensively, digging and prying and so forth.
There are pieces of clamshell that have been drilled to make a flat bead, and then there are lines around the beads, a decorative thing. A couple of shells that have been sort of notched like combs. So there's a lot of what we would think of as women's stuff in the mine. Of course, there are many women's tools in the mine.
Here are a couple exquisite bone artifacts that probably didn't have to do with mining of chert, but rather my guess is that they had more to do with domestic activities. This is a beautiful, highly polished perforating tool that comes to a very sharp end and with these remarkable decorations on it.
I found 4 olivella shells from the Pacific Ocean that had been drilled through both ends, and they were all found lying together in one place.
There was a lot of prehistoric exchange and trade of different kinds of goods and products that are reflected here. It's interesting that it took place that long ago, but it points out that native peoples were interacting very early and were not just isolated groups of people maintaining their own distinctive cultures. There are generalized lifeways that persist here for more than 11,500 years, and certainly right on down to the time of Columbus and beyond, even to the time of the arrival of Lewis and Clark.
Enormous amount of projectile points. They used the atlatl and dart, so-called spear thrower, during that 1,500-year period.
So it really opened my eyes. One of Les's things is we never dig deep enough, and I think Schmitt is a great example of just that.
In 1975, the United States Congress was about to designate 149 miles of the Upper Missouri River as a national wild and scenic river. The Bureau of Land Management contracted with Montana State University to survey the stretch from Fort Benton to the western end of Fort Peck Reservoir for evidence of prehistoric occupations. Les Davis and project supervisor Steve Auberg scanned the terraces along the sides of the river, looking for fire hearths or bones eroding out of the riverbank.
We'd set up camp, we'd work for maybe a week, 10 days out of one camp, and then we'd move on down. The BLM would resupply us. They had a big John boat and they could move up and down river, and they would resupply us.
Along this stretch of the Missouri, Davis documented the transition from atlatl hunters, represented by the Pelican Lake points at Holmes Terrace, to the Avonlea bow and arrow culture at Lost Terrace.
We're excavating the Holmes Terrace archaeological site that's located along the Upper Missouri Wild and Scenic River in the vicinity of Big Sandy, Montana. This floor dates probably about 2,500 years ago and represents the surface occupied by early bison hunters here along the Missouri. At least during 6 intervals, prehistoric peoples occupied this landform, and we'd recovered the bone and tools and fire-broken rock that represents those occupations. Here we're excavating the deepest prehistoric occupation in Holmes Terrace. It's here at this point slightly over 2.9 meters below modern surface. We radiocarbon dated a zone here by reference to bison bone in 1977, and it dated about 1000 BC.
One foggy morning in July, archaeologist Steve Auberg was surveying the bank of the river with binoculars. He spotted a thin horizontal layer of mammal bones, plus the remnants of a fire hearth 12 feet below the surface of the cut bank. Auberg and Davis decided to investigate the archaeological site that would later become known as Lost Terrace. It turned out to be one of the most unusual prehistoric campsites they had ever seen. Bison were usually abundant in this lush prairie, and they were the preferred food source. They also provided bones, horns, hooves, sinew, and hides as raw materials. As Davis said, the bison afforded a hardware store-like stock of raw materials essential for life support. But the bison were nowhere to be found that fateful winter. Perhaps a harsh or early cold snap caused the bison herds to remain farther south. Auberg had discovered a rare pronghorn antelope kill site from 1,000 winters ago.
The real hard time was the early spring, because their fat supplies would be depleted. The fat supplies of other species on which they would be dependent upon are also depleted. It just depends on how long is it from the break of winter into true spring. This is the critical season for many game species. And humans, of course, under these circumstances would also be subject to those kind of stresses.
Out of necessity, the resourceful Avonlea people went after a population of pronghorn for winter sustenance. Zoo archaeologist Michael Wilson determined that the remains of 84 adults and 25 unborn pronghorn were unearthed at this kill site, representing one winter of occupation.
So they possessed the know-how. They were keen observers of every living thing. Even though they didn't hunt pronghorn, they knew everything there was to know about pronghorn behavior. And when forced by circumstances, that is, unavailable bison and being in difficult condition, they could kill pronghorn. They had the technology for it. They understood the behavior. They would just adapt their technology and their hunting techniques to another species.
So we have to pass all of the sediments that we remove by excavation through a very fine screen in order to recover these very fine residues. Here, for example, the skeletal remains of nearly 50 unborn pronghorn antelope. These unborn pronghorns are about 3 months from full term. So it's late winter, February to March activity. And we can compare their sizes from one animal to another, and again deduce the stage of development they were in at the time. Their mothers were killed by prehistoric hunters using bow and arrow.
A famous National Geographic cover from 1979 displayed a dramatic recreation of Clovis points from the Anzac burial site north of Livingston, Montana. The image was part of an article titled "Search for the First Americans." Montana archaeologist Larry Larin was with Davis on the Lindsay Mammoth dig in 1967. A year later, he was investigating the exciting Anzac Clovis burial site. Stunning, large Clovis projectile points were found alongside the skeletal remains of a 10-year-old boy. The artifacts and human remains were dusted with red ochre, a pigment well known for its use in Native American rituals. This is the only confirmed Clovis burial site in the Americas. DNA from the Anzac child would eventually lead to an understanding of the deep roots in North America of modern Native American tribes. The search for Paleo Indians in America was reaching a fever pitch, and Davis was determined to find more evidence of these earliest people in Montana. He called it his search for the first Montanans. Now Davis was dancing around a time so deep in the human past of North America that he was observing the transition between the Pleistocene and Holocene epochs.
So I loved that Les was the first person to think about, well, where were those ice sheets on the ground? And then where are the archaeological remains that date to that, at least, the earliest paleo stuff, and to start looking for patterns.
Davis and geologist Chris Hill developed maps of terminal moraines and ice proximal lakes and tried to match known Paleo Indian sites with the landscape of 13,000 years ago. At the height of the Clovis First thesis in 1975, Davis and his team had been contracted to survey the limestone hills in south central Montana before the Army National Guard used the area as a gunnery range. As they studied the cut banks along Indian Creek, John Fisher recognized a distinctive layer of volcanic ash indicating a major geologic event at that time. Mount Mazama in the Cascade Range erupted 7,700 years ago and left a gaping caldera that became Crater Lake, Oregon. The eruption was the largest in the Cascade volcanic arc in the last million years, raining volcanic ash on an area of over 350,000 square miles. This ash layer is a common marker for archaeologists for dating purposes. When Fisher identified the Mount Mazama ash layer, they knew that any artifacts found below the ash were from ancient humans living in the area more than 7,700 years ago. Soon Davis found evidence of charcoal from an ancient campfire at the base of the towering cut bank.
He was kind of walking along the cut bank and he found a hearth that was eroding from the bank, and it was probably 5 to 6 meters below surface. And this vertical cut bank's hanging over Les, and he's working with a trowel. He's troweling, exposing this feature, which ended up being Folsom age. And but he was working there, and we were working the main excavation, just which is, I don't know, maybe 75 meters away. And I kept looking over there. I said, Les, you can't be working under there. He says, this is something. I got to finish this. I got to recover this. And so he stayed there, and I thought we were going to be digging for him at some point, but he got it out of there.
At Indian Creek, Davis found what appeared to be a Clovis occupation some 25 feet below the modern surface. In the same layer, just above bedrock, they also found volcanic ash from the Glacier Peak eruption in the Cascade Range, which had been radiocarbon dated to around 13,000 years before present. This put the bottom of the excavation right at the Clovis level. Maybe this was why more Folsom and Clovis occupations had not been found in Montana, Davis speculated, because they were so deeply buried and difficult to locate.
Ken, I brought along and arranged some of the stone artifacts from the Indian Creek site to give you some sense of what they look like and what they were used for. This is all Indian Creek site materials here, and next to it I have specimens from the Schmitt site that we'll see next. I have a number of projectile points here laid out in sequence from earliest to most recent. This is 11,000 years old. This goes up to 9,000 years old. This is the only excavated Clovis artifact, usually used elsewhere by peoples who were hunting elephant, although we have no elephant represented at this site here. From that earliest projectile point, which was used on a lance or spear, and we have the next one that we call Hell Gap, that is about 10,500 years old to 10,000 years old. This is an agate basin projectile point that's somewhat later than 10,500 years old and our part of the world. Now these are the kinds of heavy-duty artifacts that essentially hunters of early bison used in the 11,000-year-old part of the site.
Davis had an obsession with obsidian, and indeed wrote his dissertation on the use of obsidian on the northwestern plains. Obsidian, or volcanic glass, was an important lithic resource for native peoples as far back as the Pleistocene. It made the sharpest blades and was highly sought after by Native Americans for its superior flint-knapping qualities. So much so that Obsidian Cliff on the Yellowstone Plateau became one of the first indigenous mining industries in North America. In 1960, Irving Friedman and Robert Smith of the U.S. Geological Survey developed a way to age date obsidian.
I was working at a site up in eastern Montana called the Keister site. Since we found 2 large obsidian projectile points in with the bison bones, I sent them off immediately and started an association then in 1961 with Irving Friedman, and continued to work with him until his death. And Irving was a remarkable scientist.
Obsidian hydration dating allows obsidian to be age dated from the time a fresh surface is made, as in the manufacture of spear or arrow points. From that time forward, water molecules are absorbed into the obsidian, creating a hydration rind that can be measured.
When a piece of obsidian is broken off of the cliff, the clock starts ticking, because that surface on that has no hydration, has no layer. So it starts ticking because it starts sucking the moisture into its interior.
Friedman didn't stop there. Using X-ray fluorescence, he was the first to show that obsidian could be sourced to the outcrop from which it came. Because obsidian is found only where volcanic activity has occurred, no obsidian sources exist east of the Mississippi. It was soon discovered that Yellowstone obsidian is found far and wide in archaeological sites across the continent. This innovative new tool allowed researchers to begin to understand ancient continent-wide trade networks, such as that of the rich Mississippian mound cultures. Thriving prehistoric Native American communities supported tens of thousands of people in the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys over 5,000 years ago. Thanks to an industrious trade network, they acquired a wide variety of resources from across North America, including marine shells and shark's teeth from the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, mica from the Appalachian Mountains, galena from the upper Mississippi Valley, copper from the Great Lakes, Knife River flint from North Dakota, and obsidian from Obsidian Cliff on the Yellowstone Plateau.
We had good fortune to be under contract to do work at Obsidian Cliff for the National Park Service at the time of the big fire.
The day they were to start their inventory, the cliff burned. So obviously, we're not going there this summer. But in June, when they went back, there was no vegetation. It was perfect. You could see everywhere.
With the forest stripped bare of undergrowth by the fires, the team found obsidian excavation pits all across the Obsidian Cliff Plateau. The survey demonstrated the importance of Obsidian Cliff as a far-reaching lithic resource for Native peoples. Ann Johnson worked with Les Davis, Steve Auberg, and geologist Jim Schmitt to write the National Historic Landmark nomination. Obsidian Cliff gained National Historic Landmark status in 1996. The first signs of the Clovis culture, with their magnificent fluted spear points, appear in the archaeological record around 13,300 years ago. Then, some 400 years later, the climate of the northern hemisphere was thrust into a 1,000-year cold period. The last gasp of the Pleistocene epoch known as the Younger Dryas. Scandinavian scientists, studying layered peat bogs, recognized an abrupt climate change when they identified the flower, Dryas occidentalis, in the pollen record. Greenland ice core records also indicate the return to Ice Age conditions from 12,900 to 11,700 years ago. The northern hemisphere cooled by 9 to 12 degrees centigrade. The Clovis culture disappeared, and 38 species of large North American megafauna also went extinct at or before the end of the Younger Dryas. In the summer of 1946, Tag Riddle and his gang of adolescent explorers found a cave in a remote corner of the family homestead near Wolf Creek, Montana. They had youthful visions of finding pirate's gold and silver-handled dueling pistols. As they ventured deeper into the cave and widened the dank passages, they began finding large bones and Indian artifacts. For the rest of his life, Tag and his family explored and excavated Blacktail Cave. It was a treasure trove, but not exactly the pirates' loot they were dreaming of. Les Davis developed a long friendship with Tag Riddle, and over the years helped him to learn proper methods of archaeology. Riddle became a seasoned avocational archaeologist.
Dig a little deeper, dig a little deeper, dig a little deeper, dear. Don't mind if he's old.
We have over 28 Ice Age animals that we found during that first dig in there, including everything from a mouse inside of the nostrils of that great big old muskox that died probably about the same time he did. We found some bones of the mastodon in there too, so we have all the way coming up the whole line. We've got camel bones also we found inside the cave. These here ages on these muskox and the Kodiak bear skulls and that Bison occidentalis skull are all about 11,500 years old.
This looks like it's probably one of the ribs of our muskox from inside the cave, just recovered today.
Davis had heard about a Goshen projectile point close in age to Clovis that was found in the cave. He wanted to excavate to see if he could verify a Paleo Indian association with extinct Ice Age mammals that had been found there.
A real jumble of fossils, materials that go back well into the last Ice Age, and possible association around 11,300 years ago of humans with one or more of these fossils.
We associate Montana with large mammals like grizzly bears, elk, wolves, and bison. But at the end of the Ice Age, it might have looked more like wildlife on steroids. Mammoth and giant bison are well known in Paleo Indian archaeological sites across the state. But Davis and colleagues found quite an eye-opening array of Pleistocene megafauna thriving in Montana prior to the Younger Dryas extinction. At Sheeprock Spring, a few miles northwest of Whitehall, Montana, Davis and his team found an assemblage of extinct late Pleistocene mammals, including cheetah, horse, camel, short-faced bear, and giant bighorn sheep. Again, Davis was straddling the Younger Dryas and the end of the Pleistocene epoch.
Well, it took a fair bit of glue to get them all back together. I think we've got an idea of what we got here now, Les. We've got two bones here, really, that are
both from the same part of an animal, but they're from very different animals. These are metapodials. They're the middle foot bones, if you like. And you see here there's a single toe on this one, so this is from a horse. That one has actually evidence that two toes were coming off it, so it's from a split-hoofed animal, and it's from a mountain sheep.
No human artifacts were found associated with the extinct megafauna. But above the mammal bones, in the early Holocene, Paleo Indian artifacts dating to around 11,000 years ago were abundant. Several patterns were beginning to emerge from sites Davis was excavating in the region. Paleo Indians seemed to prefer mountain foothill environments for campsites, and, unlike the big game hunter caveman mythology, they utilized a wide variety of small to medium-sized mammals like rabbit and deer, along with an occasional large mammal. In more recent layers, they found evidence that this area was a retooling campsite where people stopped briefly to create chipped stone implements for weaponry and domestic uses. The site was used almost continuously from the end of the Ice Age through the middle pre-contact period. Obsidian from both Bear Gulch, Idaho, and Obsidian Cliff in Yellowstone were found there, emphasizing the complex trade networks of indigenous Montanans. In a one-of-a-kind flint knapping sequence excavated at the site, 947 lithic pieces are believed to represent a single knapping episode. 6,000 years ago, an Aboriginal artisan brought a core of greenish-gray chert to a temporary campsite at Sheeprock Spring. The flint knapper was unsuccessful in his first attempt to create a biface knife. The core broke into 3 pieces. He salvaged the biggest broken piece and tried again, percussing with a round cobble, and created a smaller biface knife. The finished tool and the pieces of the puzzle laid there for 6,000 years. Davis later wrote, "The uniqueness of this knapping feature is that with little imagination, a short span of time in one human's life can be visualized." A number of theories exist to explain the sudden climate reversals and mass extinctions at the end of the Pleistocene. Some researchers suggest that the extinctions and the demise of Clovis were a result of overhunting by the Clovis culture. Others hypothesize that climate change was the culprit, caused by a meltwater disruption of the conveyor-like Atlantic deep water current that transports warm tropical water to the north. Another bitterly contested theory presents evidence that a comet impact on the Laurentide ice sheet caused catastrophic meltwater floods and created a nuclear winter scenario. It's possible that some combination of these events contributed to the life-altering Younger Dryas and the tumultuous end of the Pleistocene epoch. It has now been well documented that Clovis was not the first culture to inhabit the Americas. Many sites in the Americas show evidence of pre-Clovis occupations. 14,500-year-old artifacts at Monte Verde at the southern tip of South America have been verified. Recently, fossilized human footprints at White Sands National Park in New Mexico were radiocarbon dated to 23,000 years ago by the Association of Embedded Ditchgrass Seeds. New evidence is pushing human habitation of the Americas well before the opening of the ice-free corridor. Patrick Rennie went back to the MacHaffie site again in 2018 and continued to dig deeper at Montana's oldest Paleo Indian excavation.
This particular group of people that have assembled, so some of us old archaeology buddies of Les's son, and then these people that the tradition of supporting avocational archaeologists is so strong here today. You know, so Patrick Rennie has really taken on that role of that Les had done for decades and decades, to really work with locals and ranchers and bring them in. Because so many places it's just a very exclusive academic club. And Les was never like that. He was always working hard to do the right thing. And yeah, I just have the utmost of admiration for him as a human being and as an archaeologist. Yeah, and as a humanist.
In the oppressive heat of a Montana summer afternoon, they found what Davis had been looking for all those decades.
I'm stunned.
We've been looking a long time for that.
I actually never thought that we'd really find a paleo point out here.
This, and I saw this work side.
Wow.
And then Mel took it.
I don't know how much volume or quantity of dirt we moved, but it was cubic meters and looking for this.
A finely crafted Folsom projectile point, much like the one found in Folsom, New Mexico, nearly 100 years earlier.
Somebody sat down approximately 10,000 years ago and made that, and for whatever reasons left it here.
Oh, Les must be so excited.
It's a once in a lifetime experience.
What's the point?
This is really what prompted Les to dig here, trying to find some of the earliest evidence of humans in Montana, and you know, what is it, 3 years after his death, finally sees his dream realized.
In a career spanning 50 years, Montana archaeologist Les Davis pursued evidence of the earliest inhabitants of Montana. Flake by flake, charred seed by obsidian projectile point, he pieced together a rich interpretation of over 13,000 years of the lifeways of indigenous Montanans. In 1990, Davis became curator of Paleo Indian archaeology at the Museum of the Rockies in Bozeman. Soon after, he heard about a site that would revolutionize his thinking about Paleo Indian lifeways in Montana. 40 miles south of Sheeprock Spring, in the Greenhorn Range, two Montana families had been digging for sapphires in 1972, when they unearthed treasures of another kind. 9,000-year-old projectile points from a lost Paleo Indian clan. The story made its way to Les Davis, and he secured permission to excavate the site known as Barton Gulch. What he found there painted a vivid picture of Paleo Indian life in Montana.
This is one of the 16 paleo kitchens located at the Barton Gulch site. This is the real-life excavated feature concluded 2 years ago. We've already recovered all of the archaeological materials, the animal remains, the plant remains from this particular feature, which was really loaded and extremely informative. There are three classes of features. This large, fairly shallow basin-shaped one in the center has an oxidation rim around it in red, because this is where they produce the coals. They burned pine, willow, and sagebrush in large amounts and took the coals from that big feature put it in the bottom of these large, deep features that go around it. Here there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ovens. They then placed the coals in those ovens and then went through a process of introducing plant and animal remains to produce the foodstuffs on which they depended.
Davis had unearthed a complex ancient campsite, rich with all aspects of Paleo Indian life. Davis and his crew attempted to reproduce the paleo kitchens, and graduate student Steve Armstrong conducted paleo cooking experiments.
My thesis work for my master's degree was on Barton Gulch, experimental archaeology, trying to reproduce the little earth oven kitchen complexes that we were digging at the Barton Gulch site. They were dated to about 9,400 years old. So I was trying to reproduce the results that we were finding from our excavation in terms of the roasting pits. I used some of the same materials that we were finding in the excavation, such as the prickly pear cactus, rabbit, and basically it's kind of the same technology or things that we do today. Say a pig roast. You dig a hole in the ground, you build a fire, you put the coals in, you throw the food in and bury it, and a few hours later it's food, dinner.
Paleo-ethnobotanist Steve Auberg analyzed the residues of long-ago meals in the paleo kitchens. Auberg identified 31 species of plants, possibly being used by the Barton Gulch clan. Slim-leaf goosefoot and prickly pear cactus seeds were the most abundant. He identified several plant species that could have been used for medicinal purposes. Many of the goosefoot seeds found in the roasting pits were popped, suggesting a possible method of preparing the seeds for consumption.
Many of the plants were simply eaten raw in their natural state. But they did prepare camas, bitterroot. But they ate berries and many kinds of plums and ripe fruits, simply ate them right off the bush. Didn't require any preparation whatsoever.
Zoo archaeologist Jack Fisher studied the animal remains to determine what species were being used by the Barton Gulch clan. Deer were the most abundant, and both cottontail and jackrabbit were also used extensively. Fisher identified cut marks on the deer bones and scars of hammerstones crushing the bones. Most likely, marrow was harvested from the pulverized bone, and bone needles were manufactured from bone splinters. Lithics analyst Sally Thompson studied the stone artifacts with an eye toward domestic activities.
The Barton Gulch site has such well-preserved family hearth area activities and the work at the camp. And I was drawn back into that work because my dissertation not long before that was focused on what's invisible, in the archaeological record. It's harder to find and harder to excavate and make sense of really these kind of more subtle activities, and the preservation of the features there was exquisite, and Les did a really great job of recognizing the uniqueness of the site.
A mysterious incised stone artifact was excavated from the 10,600-year-old level. Some have suggested it may be a grinding tool for atlatl points. Certainly the power of human imagination was at work here, but we may never know the ultimate purpose.
When I was in grad school in the 70s, really everything about the books about Paleo Indians were all called Early Man in the New World and things like that. And I got so sick of doing the research because it was all about men and men's activities and macho hunters. So even the macho archaeologists were looking for the most macho site where the biggest animals were killed.
In all cases, I think, and we're just beginning to learn this, that for people 9,500 years ago, they were doing a lot more than focusing on a high protein food source. They were using a wide variety of plants that were available seasonally to augment it, and using a large number of small mammals, using marmot and prairie dog, ground squirrel, cottontail, jackrabbit, mink. A lot of lesser species were thrown into the pot. So while like we all might prefer to have a T-bone, there's that day when the inevitable hamburger looks very good in the absence of the energy to go out and hunt a bison.
On a daily basis, you're going to count on the women's work, you know, not only seed production and that kind of thing, but with the kids, small game, snaring rabbits, or, you know, all that kind of stuff, and really bringing in a lot of the food you could count on. Then the men were out there hoping they were going to get something big that would last so you could dry for the winter, but they didn't always, right?
Finding evidence of domestic activities of people 11,000 years ago is extremely difficult and rare. But with new technologies and a drive to understand the subtleties of Paleo Indian life, Davis was one of the first to interpret the domestic activities of the Paleo Indian forebears in Montana. And Barton Gulch was a treasure trove of clues to the daily lives of the women of ancient America. For thousands of years, Native families trekked to this verdant valley in the Ruby River drainage of southwestern Montana. Clear water ran cold from the melting snowfields. Mule deer found abundant grass to graze in the lush meadows. The people hunted small to medium-sized game with the atlatl and dart. Women and kids dug prickly pear cactus and gathered slim-leaf goosefoot for the seeds. They picked chokecherries and rose hips to mix with venison to make pemmican. They scraped the flesh from deerskins with chert scrapers and cut tendons with obsidian knives. Once the hides were tanned, the women used delicate bone needles to sew clothing for their growing families. Undoubtedly, members of the Barton Gulch clan were well clothed. Artisans would surely be chipping flint and obsidian, creating tools and weapons. There easily could have been women flint knappers and men who engaged in domestic chores. They gathered around communal kitchens to prepare food while they talked of their daily adventures and the future of their clan. This was a community of people much like ourselves. Individuals with different skills, desires, and beliefs, all living beneath the veil of the heavens.
And therein, I think, lies the ingenuity that enabled 11,500 of years of the use of Montana by prehistoric peoples. They used it extensively, apparently used it well, and left only trace marks on its landscapes. And a good many of those trace marks are effectively invisible. And that's what we as archaeologists try to do, is to find those traces and to weave those traces through excavation into fabrics that help us get a grip on and develop a kind of appreciation about the past that isn't accessible or available through any other method.
In his epic quest to find evidence of the first Montanans, Les Davis humanized Paleo Indian culture in Montana, and he inspired a new generation of researchers to continue the quest. The end of the Younger Dryas, 11,600 years ago, marked the beginning of the Holocene epoch. The career of Les Davis came to an end just as the Holocene was transitioning to a new proposed geologic epoch, the Anthropocene, or the age of humankind. Davis had studied over 13,000 years of successful indigenous human occupation in Montana. Now, entering this daunting new age where humans have overwhelming influence over the fate of our own species and all others, Davis said it well. Excavating the dirt of archaeology is easy. It is removing the dust of ignorance that is the challenge.